Hello, Solar Eclipse Timer users. This is Dr. Telepin with part 2 of the spooky eclipse story, the continuation of the story about the change in the character of the lighting that occurs just before totality. You have to see the effect for yourself. It is the weirdest, most eerie appearing natural lighting effect that you will ever witness. It can only be experienced at a total solar eclipse. Let's get into part 2. Observe changes in ambient lighting. In part 1, I stated that to understand the change in ambient lighting, we had to discuss 4 interesting things. So in part 1, we covered the pupil and the retina and linear light rays. In this video, we will discuss the Purkinje effect and solar limb color shift. In part 1, we looked at this diagram and discussed the decreasing light in terms of the full spectrum of light just getting dimmer as the eclipse progressed. This is the process of dark adaptation, which allows us to continue to see as our surroundings get dimmer. Now we have to discuss dark adaptation as it regards changing the color tones we see. About 4 to 5 minutes, at most 6 minutes before totality, you start to realize the light is decreasing. Try to concentrate on the overall color tone of your surroundings. At 2 minutes before totality, my app will also remind you to start to look for shadow bands, so you have to do both. This is the most odd lighting situation you will ever witness on Earth. If you have a moment to appreciate it, it seems ominous. It makes the last moments before totality even more exciting. Your surroundings appear as if you are looking at them with a gray-silver tint on them. It's not really like looking through lightly tinted sunglasses. It's different than that. It's more like the tint is on the things you are looking at. It's hard to explain. You have to witness it for yourself. But there are scientific explanations for the effect, and they are fascinating. So let's talk about it. This animation shows the eclipse progressing. The red dots represent the light decreasing, and the black boxes represent your awareness lagging behind what is actually occurring. This was discussed in depth in part 1. Because the dimming occurs slowly and our visual system is so good at dark adapting, we don't notice the change until very late in the partial phases. This curve is real data measuring the ambient light in units of lux at the 2017 eclipse. It was obtained in Oregon by Dave Vernier using a Vernier data logger from his company. This is the same curve modified to mark 15 minutes before totality. Look how much the light has decreased. Look how close we have to be to totality to witness this ambient lighting effect. The point is, for us to get to the stage where we witness the wonderful color tone changes, we need to have a lot of light block. We have to be forced to dark adapt to the point where we are in the zone of mesopic vision, because this is the crucial point where our retina is utilizing both cones and rods to see. Look at the cone function on the chart. The cones that work best in bright light give us fine vision and allow us to see color are contributing less to what we see. Look at the rod function range on the chart. The rods, which are used for dark vision, see less detail and are not involved with color, are contributing more to what we see. Remember, it is not an abrupt switch from one type of cell to the other. It is a continuum. This change in the priority of photoreceptor cells causes our perception of colors to change, and this is called the Purkinje effect. This may be the main component for the weird lighting that occurs. 2 things are happening simultaneously in the mesopic zone. More rods are working, and they have a peak absorption at 498 nanometers to the blue-green portion of the spectrum. They are not very sensitive to red. So as they contribute more, we perceive the color of our surroundings shifting towards the blue-green spectrum. The cones, which are strong at absorbing in the red portion of the spectrum, are now contributing less. This is another reason why we perceive the color surroundings shift towards the blue-green spectrum. As you have more time to recruit more rods, you get closer to scotopic vision, where you perceive less and less color saturation. This is what happens when you're outside and it is really dark. Objects that had color during the day don't have color because there's not enough full spectrum light to reflect the color to you, and you are using your rods, which are black and white. So during mesopic vision, what the Purkinje effect basically does is make blue-greens look brighter and reds look darker. So everything around you that has red color to it begins to get less saturated and more bland. And everything around you that has blue-green color to it becomes slightly more prominent due to the rods. The Purkinje effect, along with dimming lighting, along with the sharp shadows in one axis, and the less fine vision detail when using rods, are all things that contribute to this fascinating odd period of lighting before totality. It is impossible to document the Purkinje effect with a single photo taken with a digital camera because cameras use a color imaging chip that won't shift its peak spectrum sensitivity as surrounding light levels dim. They are not the biologic system of cones and rods and neural pathways and brain integration that gives us our sense of color during dark adaptation. But I can do an experiment and try to simulate the effect for you in a photo editing program. I took this picture outside with daylight lighting. I have the doctor statue from the pinhole projection video and red flowers with green leaves. Let's watch these objects as I simulate the change in lighting from first contact to the mesopic zone and try to fake a Purkinje effect to create the way your surroundings will look just prior to totality. So first, we have to decrease the brightness. I just bumped down the brightness. I'm going to decrease it again. Now, I just decreased the saturation. And one more decrease in brightness. Another decrease in saturation. Now our eyes are switching over to rods, so I'm going to change the color temperature and add a little blue. Add a little more blue. Decrease the saturation one more time. Do you see how the image is getting a gray-silver tone to it? This is actually a fairly good simulation of the color change in your surroundings. This is the best I can do to prepare you for what to look for at the eclipse. Now, to back out of the changes, remove the blue, go to normal saturation, go to normal brightness. This is back to the first contact appearance of color. The fourth and final component to the odd lighting right before totality may be related to the fact that at this point in the eclipse, your observing position is being lit only by light that is coming from the thin crescent limb of the sun. I say may be related because I'm not sure this has ever been definitively documented. Although the sun looks two-dimensional to us when we look at it through solar glasses, of course the sun is a sphere. It is shining light in all directions at all times. So during the day, we are facing one side of the sphere. Let's compare the concept to a full spectrum light bulb and concentrate on the horizontal plane of the bulb. It's clear to you that the bulb is creating light 360 degrees around its horizontal plane. This is of course the same for the sun. Now let's put the full spectrum light bulb in a room in my house and look at it from above. Again, it's clear that the light is emitted 360 degrees around the bulb into the room. So I'm going to put myself in the room. And since this is a full spectrum light bulb, this side of the room is lit by the full spectrum of light. All of the colors look normal to me. Now I move to here. It's the same. Or here, or here. No matter where I am in the room, my surroundings are lit by the full spectrum of light. Okay, follow me here. Let's change things and add a block to the light. Here I am in the room and something is blocking some of the light. Fine, but it's the same bulb. So it may be getting dimmer, but I expect the full spectrum of light. Let's block some more. It's dimmer, but I am still getting the full spectrum of light, so the colors look normal. What if the light were blocked so much that only the very edge of the bulb were providing me with light? Yes, it would be dimmer, but other than that, the bulb has not changed, so I expect the spectrum to be the same. What about the sun? Is this the same for the sun? Here I am being lit by the limb of the light bulb. It would look like a crescent to me if the black blocker in this diagram was a sphere. So what about the crescent sun during an eclipse? Should we expect the same full spectrum of light? What do you think? The three layers of the atmosphere of the sun are the photosphere, the chromosphere, and the corona. The visible surface we see is the photosphere. The next layer is the chromosphere, and this is red in color, but it is many times less bright than the photosphere, so it can only be seen with a hydrogen alpha filter or at a solar eclipse right before and after totality. The portion of energy from the sun that we are interested in is the visible spectrum. This is what our eyes are adapted to. On a normal day, the large center portion of the sphere of the sun sends the visible spectrum directly through the photosphere and through the chromosphere towards Earth. When you look at the sun through a solar filter, the sun appears darker around the limb. My picture from before first contact at the 2017 eclipse shows the limb darkening. Having this darkening visible is actually a marker of proper exposure of the full sun. The reasons for limb darkening as you go around the side of the curve of the sun is well studied and understood. Light on the side of the sphere can still be directed towards Earth, but it is taking a longer path because it is coming from the side of a huge curving sphere. It's also taking an altered path because some light must pass through the photosphere and chromosphere, which are thick. This is where the sun is different from our light bulb in the room discussion. The limb of the light bulb is not thick like the limb of the sun. On a normal day, the energy from the center of the sphere is overwhelming, so the limb component is small. The energy from the center of the sphere directed towards Earth has a shorter path to the surface of the sun than the energy from the limb of the sun directed towards Earth. On the limb, some energy has to travel on a tangent or an angle through the thickness of the photosphere and the chromosphere. These are measurements of the surface of the full sun in Kelvin. The center of the sphere measures about 6,300 degrees Kelvin, and the limb of the sun about 5,000 degrees Kelvin, which corresponds to the limb color shift. The center measures bluer, and the limb measures redder. These measurements are nice, but what I want to know is, does the limb, when isolated, like at an eclipse, emit a skewed visible color spectrum that reaches Earth? I have searched for, but cannot find, simple documentation of the visible light color spectrum of the sun comparing the center of the sun to the limb of the sun as it regards what is reaching Earth. Unfortunately, only a total solar eclipse enables us to be lit completely by the limb. If you wanted to try to understand and study this on a non-eclipse day, you have to figure out some way to isolate a small area of the sun for measurement with a spectrometer. The only way to do this and be able to isolate the limb on a non-eclipse day is with a very magnified view of the sun through a telescope. So my plan was to use a spectrometer through my telescopic view to do spectrum analysis. The sun has an angular diameter of 0.52 degrees in the sky, or 31.2 arc minutes. My telescope has a focal length of 2,670 millimeters. So using a 7 millimeter Nagler eyepiece, the magnification is 381. That particular eyepiece works out to give me a true field of view of 12.6 arc minutes. And the spectroscope fiber up against the eyepiece is only sampling a very small portion of the sun visible in the eyepiece glass. That sampling area is not something I can calculate, but I do know that I can hone down to a very, very small sampling area of the light from the surface of the sun. So setting up the observatory, I had my finder scope and aiming scope and the large scope all aligned and protected with solar filters. I had the fiber fixed to sample from the eyepiece of the large scope. The large scope was protected with a full aperture, Thousand Oaks glass, Type 2 solar filter. Using the aiming scope, I could point to the center of the sun and take a measurement. Then I could move the scope off the sun and take a measurement. Then I could very slowly work my way back towards the sun until the spectroscope began getting data again. In this way, I knew I was sampling very close to the limb of the sun. The spectroscope is calibrated to the center of the sun by taking a set of data there. Also, for calibration, a dark frame is taken. Both of these data sets are entered into the software, so our baseline is the spectrum of the center of the sun taken through the Thousand Oaks solar filter. So what we want to do is compare this baseline at the center of the sun to the limb of the sun. This experiment is designed to be a relative comparison between the two regions. Will the center of the sun and the limb of the sun emit exactly the same spectrum to my spectrometer on Earth, or will they differ somehow? Let's look at the data. This is a screen capture of the spectroscope taking repeated readings from the center of the sun with an integration time of 4 seconds. This is a screen capture of the spectroscope taking repeated readings with the scope pointed completely off the sun to blank sky. Now the scope has been nudged back onto the limb of the sun. This is the spectrum. The integration time is still 4 seconds. So two things are interesting. One, there is less transmission because the limb of the sun is dimmer. I would expect that using the same integration time. Two, look at the color spectrum. It is shifted. There is clearly a drop-off in the blues, greens, and yellows. To make the comparison better, I increased the integration time to 5 seconds. And then again to 6 seconds to have a similar transmission percentage. The drop-off towards the lower frequencies is clear. Here is the center of the sun again. Here is the limb of the sun again. So this experiment gives us additional information about color changes when we are being lit just from the limb. More experimentation is needed because this data shows a relative change, but it is not calibrated for spectrum measurements. But this is the best I can do in a non-eclipse situation. This data is interesting because it makes analyzing the Purkinje effect during an eclipse more complex. Remember, the Purkinje effect is really an effect that happens with the decrease in full spectrum light. It is the switch to the blue-green absorption of the rods that causes the Purkinje effect. This limb spectrum data indicates that there is less blue-green spectrum from the limb, and this happens to be the spectrum that the rods are most sensitive to. Here I have overlaid the rod peak spectrum curve on the 6-second integration limb spectrum data. It is not corrected to match intensity, but it demonstrates the limb spectrum tapering downward in the region of rod peak sensitivity. This is very cool data. So this limb spectrum change, in a way, offsets the Purkinje effect as related to the rod absorption spectrum, because by default, it increases the contribution of red. But it is still getting darker and darker, so we know that cones are dropping out. It may be creating a situation where the rods are working harder, or we have to recruit more of them to try to absorb at the spectrum they like. I don't know. It's just part of the crazy time right before totality. So the next obvious experiment is to do a real-time ambient spectrum analysis during an eclipse. This would get the solar filter out of the system and get a pure measurement of the spectrum of the thin crescent phase. I'm designing the experiment and looking into the gear that will allow me to do this at the next eclipse. So in summary, all of this is dynamic. It is all changing every second. Every second there is a different mix of the 4 components we have discussed in part 1 and part 2. You are seeing something that can't be reproduced in an artificial setting. You have to get to the path of a total eclipse to witness this. So let's do a final modification of the Stockman illumination chart to review the components we have discussed. We have the ambient lighting situations that we can relate to. We add the progression of the eclipse where it fits in to create decreasing light. The pupils respond by dilating. The shadows become fuzzy in one axis and sharp in the other. There begins to be an overlap of the function of cones and rods. The Purkinje effect moves the spectrum towards the blue, and we have less color saturation. The rods impede our ability for fine detailed vision as we move towards scotopic vision. And finally, the color spectrum of the solar limb may add even another variable to our experience before totality. Thank you for watching this solar eclipse timer episode. I hope this detailed explanation of the eerie lighting during an eclipse, right before totality, makes you want to experience it for yourself. If you like my work, please subscribe by clicking the subscribe button below. Also click the little bell that will pop up. That will make sure you are notified when I release new episodes about solar eclipses. Share the video with friends and post comments and questions. I'd like for you to subscribe, but if you don't, please at least check in on this channel. I plan to make it the best total solar eclipse resource on the internet. Thanks again. I appreciate your time.